Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's Maynard, Mike, and Colin with an exciting edition of Close of Business Tuesday. We've all been following over the last 10 days what's been happening in Afghanistan, and our hearts go out to all the suffering that's happening. And as Americans, we're all watching it concerned and with certainly feelings of gratitude for our military. We wanted to try and discuss what's happening there and put it in the context of the geopolitics of energy. And so we've called on one of our great friends, Frank Fannon. Frank's now a managing director with Fannon Global Advisors. He's also a senior advisor with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And you'll remember from his previous appearances with us, he was the inaugural assistant secretary for the U.S. Bureau of Energy Resources. So Frank was one of the first ones thinking about the energy transition and geopolitics. And he was kind enough to introduce us to Nathan Sales. Nathan is now a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. He was the former acting undersecretary for civilian security, democracy, and human rights with the Department of State, and a former ambassador at large and coordinator for counterterrorism. So these two guys, you may have seen them on some other channels. They've been popular flavors. We're lucky to call them friends. And so let me just stop and say, Frank and Nathan, it's so great to have you with us today.
Yeah, thanks, man. Good to be with you guys.
You guys have accomplished so much. I've probably botched your high points there, but hopefully I didn't get to the fact that Frank worked at BHP and Nathan worked at Kirkland and Ellis. So you guys have really fantastic and interesting careers. Can't wait to talk with you about all this stuff.
Likewise, looking forward to the conversation.
So, Mike, thanks for instituting a little oil rally. Things were getting a little too red over the last 30 days. You must have, what did you do to get this market going again?
Yeah, Maynard, it's good to see the screen green for a change. Look, I mean, you had a bunch of things working to the detriment of crude oil prices. You had the U.S. dollar was going higher, which is typically bad for commodities. You had interest rates were going down. You had, issues we had talked about in the past, demand issues. One of the things that was getting the market all concerned was China corona cases. It looks like that's kind of, peaked out right now, and it looks like it's going down. And then just a couple days ago, you had a big Pemex platform just blow up. They're not able to inject gas into their into this complex, and you've taken a little over 400,000 barrels a day of crude oil off the market, which is 25% of Mexico's production. So that has helped quite a bit. And, one has to wonder, since Pemex is pretty hedged out, they usually run a big hedging program every year, if they're scrambling for physical barrels against that. But, so it's just a lot of things have been working it against. And then the last thing really is, everyone's been talking about this Jackson Hole meeting that's going to be happening here this Friday. What the Fed's going to do. I think most people think that there's going to be some, more dovish talk, maybe some tapering. And I think what's going to happen is all the, equities, interest rates, bonds, dollar, they're all going to be queuing off what's going to happen on Friday. I think there's been a little bit of people, posturing beforehand, but all of this is coming to a head this week. So, we're seeing the equity market move, the energy equities move, simply because the group was massively oversold. Crude oil was massively oversold and wasn't really reacting to fundamentals. The fundamentals still look good. The market's still undersupplied. Crude is still in backwardation. And so I just think, all these things have come together over the last couple of weeks, and now it looks like they've kind of, stabilized, and maybe they go the other way. And so that's kind of where we are right now in the crude oil markets and the energy markets.
Well, and one thing we're going to get into with the guys, this came up a little bit last week, Mike, is just if Afghanistan is a source of instability, does that spread? Does it create more volatility, and what could that do to oil prices? But we'll save that one for Frank and Nathan. Colin, what do you got on your mind this week?
Yeah, just some observations on global markets. The first is the Delta variant, as serious as it is not the primary driver of the faltering in commodity demand or prices. It's been this slowdown in China that's been the primary driver. And there's been three channels. The first has been anti-inflationary policies, including curbs on demand to relieve pressure on strained supply chains. And we can see that in the price motion of three commodities. Iron ore, as measured on the spot market, Dalian Commodity Exchange, fell 36% between June 29th and August 20th. And in the last couple of days, it's had an 8% bounce higher to 948 yuan per metric ton. Copper, Changjiang spot price made a recent high on May 10th at 77,050 yuan per metric ton. That's 6% below the all-time high from May 2006. And then it dropped 13% through August 20th. And again, we're seeing a bid emerge this week. And then the third commodity we can look at is crude oil. It's pretty clear that there's been an import price elasticity in China, sensitive to Brent prices above 70. We saw a pretty material slowdown in import demand in the past 2 months. But just given the domestic supply-demand balance in China, that's going to need to reverse as we look forward to the balance of the year. The second channel working on that slowdown is the temporary closure of the Ningbo port. That's the world's third busiest port, both on the container side and on the liquid side. It was shut down about 2 weeks ago due to some COVID cases among dock workers. So I guess there you do have a bit of a touch to COVID, but that contributed to the slower flow of crude oil into China. And then a third channel is the rapid slowdown in new credit and M2 growth in China. Back to 2018 lows of 10% and 8% year over year, respectively. Now, it's not the case that China wants this to get too far out of hand. It was a deliberate slowdown to try to cool things off from the higher prices of earlier this year. But in July, we saw China make a surprise move to loosen reserve ratios. They're now 12% for major banks, 5.5% for rural. And to put that in context, that's about half the level in the first quarter of 2018. And then on Monday, the People's Bank of China announced that they're going to deliberately follow what they're calling a cross-cyclical approach designed to smooth volatility. And that's a pretty big departure from the Keynesian approach of running policy inverse to present conditions. In other words, the Chinese are not going to wait for things to get so bad to give us stimulus or to wait for things to get so hot to give us cooling. And as Mike said, with the Federal Reserve governors gathering virtually this week, that is something that's going to be put in relief. And then all of this is working already. The September 21 coking coal futures on the Dalian Exchange are screaming higher. Since August 12th, they're up 40% to an all-time high. Mike mentioned the Pemex fire. It was an awful, deadly, horrible fire. 5 workers at least lost their lives. And so it's going to take some time to bring that back. As you probably know, on Monday, the Department of Energy also announced the sale of 20 million barrels of crude oil from the SPR. While the exact timing maybe is informed a bit by the Biden administration's growing alarm about rising gasoline prices, this really is part of an ongoing sales program required by law under 2015 and 2017 statute to sell 58 million barrels by 2025. So it really is part of a broader plan that's been in place for several years. And then finally, just on the macro side, you probably have been hearing more and more chatter about the debt ceiling. The debt ceiling of the United States was officially breached on July 31st, 2021, when a 2-year extension expired. Now, that's not a default because Secretary Yellen can shuffle around funds, which she is doing, as several of her predecessors have done before. But she says that without preemptive action to increase the debt ceiling, there will be a default by mid-September. The CBO puts the date somewhere in October or November. Now, I would say most folks in global markets know there's almost certainly not going to be a technical default, but obviously this only exacerbates the political pressures around the 2 very large spending bills moving through the U.S. House of Representatives. And let me just conclude with some figures. The U.S. public debt is now $28.428 trillion as of Friday. That is 125% of US GDP as measured by the 2Q21 figure annualized at seasonally adjusted rates. The Fed holds 5.3 trillion of this number of the paper, 19% of the total, and 1.9 trillion of its holdings have maturities of 23 or sooner. Foreign entities hold 7.2 trillion or about 25% of the outstanding paper. And then one last data point, U.S. Treasury's cash balance is now at $310 billion, lowest since December 2019. So just have those numbers foremost in your mind as we go through the conversation of the geopolitical ramifications of what's happening in Afghanistan.
That was fantastic, Colin. It makes me think we ought to go back through all the presidential debates of the last 40 years and show when we stopped asking the question about deficits and debt, because I don't think anyone even asks anymore. So we're going to make that our mission. We're going to be debt junkies. All right, let's jump in with Frank and Nathan. Guys, I know you've been watching, like all of us, over the last 2 weeks and longer as things have been unfolding in Afghanistan. Of course, you guys bring a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience with how difficult things like this can be. And of course, you both think much more broadly about the geopolitics of this. Maybe as we kick off, would you mind, and Nathan, I might just start with you, is just tell us again, what you were doing in government and maybe simulate in your mind or tell us what would be going on in government right now as you were watching this, because it looks, departments don't look coordinated. There's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions. It's a new administration that has to be making it harder. Maybe give us a little bit of your take on this whole thing.
Sure. So I guess the first thing I'd say is when I was at State, I had two roles that would have been relevant to the situation unfolding in Afghanistan. I was the head of counterterrorism, which obviously is our top priority in Afghanistan. It's why we went into Afghanistan in the first place after 9/11 to destroy the al-Qaeda network that had safe haven there. And the other role I had was the head of the rule of law and human rights portfolio. And obviously, the threat that the Taliban poses to democracy and the rule of rights is more than just an abstract one. We're hearing some alarming reports about journalists and activists and female employees of NGOs who are all at risk of being hunted down and even worse. So it seems to me, if it were Frank and me back at the State Department now calling the shots, it seems to me you'd want to get through, a couple different phases. And I think, Maynard, you're exactly right. It doesn't look like the White House was well prepared to manage the diplomatic and operational fallout from the hasty withdrawal decision. I think a couple of things you need to do. One is, over the immediate short run, your top priority has to be getting Americans out. Any American who is left behind after U.S. forces withdraw is going to be in hostage18videos. And with 10 to 15,000 Americans in the country, we don't actually know exactly how many, but with five-figure numbers, a hostage situation here would make the Iran hostage crisis from 1979 to 1980 look like a walk in the park. So the first thing you have to do is get all of our people out. The second thing you need to do—
Nathan, can I just ask you a question about this? Because I think all of us find this hard to understand. You'll have some visibility on it, but even though the decision, more recently, we've taken these steps to pull out our military, we've been talking about it for a long time. So the thousands of people who are there, I'm just surprised that in a way that they're still there. Or can you give any context around, like, it seems like if you were one of these American civilians working in Afghanistan in March, it seems like you would have said, I think I need to get out of here because of, why do we still have so many people on the ground, non-military people?
Well, they're there because the U.S. government asked them to be there. These are not tourists who decided, forget about the Bahamas, let's go to Kandahar. These are contractors who work for our military or for U.S.-aligned NGOs who are providing humanitarian assistance or various other programs funded by the U.S. government. And so they're there because we asked them to be there. And until quite recently, the State Department was still saying, we're going to have an ongoing diplomatic presence in Afghanistan come hell or high water. So we've sort of pulled the rug out from under them by shutting down our embassy and telling them, hey guys, guess what? You better find your way to the airport so you can get out.
So is it fair to say they're either government employees or they're working in places supported by the government? I mean, they're just part of our complex largely.
For the most part. We don't know with 100% precision, but for the most part, they're there working for or at the behest of the U.S. government.
Well, sorry, Nathan, I disrupted your flow. You said first thing, okay, let's get the people out. Let me give it back to you.
Right. The first thing is we have to get our people out. And by that, I would include not just American citizens. Those are obviously our top priority, but also vulnerable Afghans who worked with the United States for the past 20 years. Humanitarian workers, NGO representatives, journalists. These are all people who put their lives on the line to embrace American principles of free markets, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. The Taliban knows who they are. They're going to go door to door and round people up. And it's going to be a very, very ugly situation unless we're able to extract some of our Afghan allies as well. That's the short-term crisis. Once you get through the short-term crisis, getting Americans and our partners out, you start to turn to the broader strategic priorities. And I'd love to hear Frank's thoughts on this as well. But from my standpoint as a counterterrorism and rule of law and human rights guy, there are at least 3 or 4 things that policymakers will need to be focusing on. And the first is, Al-Qaeda has never really broken with the Taliban. The Taliban has given these guys sanctuary. And we degraded al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. But in the wake of the Biden administration's withdrawal, there's a real risk that al-Qaeda is going to try to rebuild itself in Afghanistan. And so one of our first medium-term priorities has to be finding a way to take those terrorists off the battlefield. And that's really hard to do if you don't have intelligence capabilities in the country, which we're not really going to have anymore. And if you don't have strike assets nearby, drones or aircraft that can actually engage the enemy on the battlefield. So you need to figure that out. And then another thing you need to do is figure out what the international community's posture is going to be towards the Taliban. I think we're already starting to feel pressure from some voices in the region, in Russia and China as well, to adopt a sort of sophisticated, realistic approach. Well, the Taliban's in charge now, and so the United Nations should recognize them, and the United States should recognize them, and that will just give us more leverage. I have to say, I find that argument unpersuasive in the extreme. The United States has a number of sanctions in place, and indeed the United Nations has a number of sanctions in place against the Taliban as a whole, and also against key figures within the Taliban. And it seems to me that those sanctions can be a very powerful source of leverage to try and induce behavior from the Taliban. Now, in other words, we shouldn't give anything away for free. We should insist on clear performance according to international expectations before we even begin to have a conversation about recognition or sanctions relief. And Maynard, the last thing I'll say, I have to say I'm not optimistic that the Taliban actually is going to live up to the standards that the international community will place on them. This is a medieval death cult that wants to return Afghanistan to the Dark Ages. And I think that is their priority far more than it is receiving financial assistance from the World Bank or humanitarian aid from NGOs based in London. So watch what they do, not what they say, because they're media savvy. They're going to say things that cater to Western audiences, but watch their behavior. And on that front, I have to say I'm not optimistic.
Yeah, they don't seem like the kind of guys who say, ooh, sanctions. That's making me nervous, But Frank, you were so much of your time in government, you were thinking about the geopolitics of energy and the energy transition. What does this do to the geopolitics of, I think in energy, China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, all the guys that are troublemakers or have influence on energy, et cetera. what do you think they're thinking right now, or what would you be doing in your old role right now?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess, going back with respect to the energy transition, the reason why Afghanistan's kind of, from my vantage point, is relevant is because they have a lot of good rocks. I mean, they have some of the key minerals that are needed for the energy transition: lithiums, copper, rare earth elements, among others. And so we as the United States, through the U.S. Geological Survey back in 2010, did an assessment and found that they have a considerable endowment of this mineral resource there. But of course, the demand for these minerals wasn't then what it is today. It's only been since about 2018 since the world really understood, in the aftermath of the Paris Climate Accord, what minerals would be required in order to achieve the renewable technologies to achieve anything close to the Paris target. So that's created this remarkable increase in demand for these minerals. And one of the things when we were doing in government is created, knowing that the U.S. And rather the West more broadly, but the U.S. in particular, has kind of ceded its position as a dominant mining nation. We have plenty of good rocks in North America, but we've turned our back on developing them and instead relied, like we did on so many other things, for development of those minerals from other jurisdictions. China moved into that void in significant ways, and now dominates not just the minerals exploitation in countries around the world, including in China, but the entirety of the clean energy supply chain, and now is responsible for something like 70% plus of solar PV manufacturing. So the West and the U.S. in particular, under the former administration, and we see a degree of continuity in this regard with this administration, has sought to help level up the standards. And so a program that I created called the Energy Resource Governance Initiative sought to work with countries that had significant mineral wealth but might lack the capacity to manage them, to help train those countries. This is where Afghanistan comes in, because it was something that we started talking about in the latter days of developing ERGI, was to what countries should we reach out to see if they would like to partner with us. Afghanistan was one of those potential countries because they were striving, not only did the right thing at all, but they were striving toward this notion of increasing this level of governance to provide the development dollars in the form of mineral development that they need for their own country. Now that's gone away. So demand is still high. And in a perverse way, a Taliban strong-arm government might provide the degree of strong governance to help facilitate the exploitation of these minerals. Now, Western companies won't go there, nor should they, and I can speak about that. But it does create an avenue for the Chinese Communist Party, who's not too concerned about human rights, not too concerned about the repression of half a population in the form of women. They're okay to invest in certain places. And China may do so less so for the economics of those mineral development projects, but more for geopolitical reasons.
So do you think, it seems like Iran and Russia and China, those three, they figure really prominently in the energy discussion. Is it fair to say that they look at this and think the U.S. will be less likely to be, will be less assertive in the international arena, and therefore, mischief making can go up? I'm leading the witnesses here, but I think that's the concern I have watching it.
Yeah, from the energy lens, they're different, and Iran and Russia are oil exporters, gas exporters. whereas China is a big importer, but China is again this leader for these clean energy technologies, which so it's a bit different lens. But I think you're exactly right in because the U.S. perceived or actual, depending on one's point of view, withdrawal from some of these more hardline positions. For example, the Biden administration chose not to move forward with strong bipartisan consensus on Nord Stream 2 against Russia. The administration has chosen not to more force our sanctions under the JCPOA withdrawal on Iran's oil exports. They want to get back into the JCPOA. So I think you see a bit of a trend line, and so it's a question on how Afghanistan, to your point, they're not too concerned about sanctions.
Well, I think the week before, one of the things we were talking about is the administration had asked OPEC to pump more oil, and you kind of combine the two. What would either of you have a feel for how the Saudis or otherwise our friends in the Mideast or maybe Israel, how is this playing? Are they just saying, well, poor execution, but we knew this was coming and we'll get through the headlines? Or do they think, hey, there's something at work here which is more problematic?
Well, maybe I'll take a swing at that and then hand it back to Frank. I think our allies are astonished and appalled by what they've seen from Washington the past 10 days. When the U.S. withdraws from Afghanistan, it's not just the U.S. withdrawing. We had 2,500 troops there, but our NATO allies had another 8,000 or so. And our NATO allies were entirely dependent on a U.S. presence for them to continue to be able to operate in Afghanistan. And so that's a problem in its own right. NATO should not be such a U.S. A dependent organization that our allies lack the ability to operate independently. But set that aside. The fact of the matter is, by pulling out essentially unilaterally, the Biden administration has put our allies in a position where they are no longer able to continue a mission that they very much believe in. I think NATO wants to keep a presence in Afghanistan, a small one. We've all learned that surges don't work, that nation building doesn't work in Afghanistan. But what could work and what has been working for the past several years is a small footprint advise and assist mission that helps train the Afghan military and that provides them with air support, which, by the way, is part of the reason why the Afghan army collapsed so quickly. We trained them to fight alongside American air power, and then the administration took that air power away. But if you keep 2,500 Americans or 8,000 NATO troops on the ground, you enable stability provided by the Afghan National Defense Forces. And you also have resources on the ground that can be used for the counterterrorism mission to collect intelligence on al-Qaeda and to take al-Qaeda operatives off the battlefield, which, let's remember, that's why we're there in the first place. But the administration's decision to withdraw, despite the wishes of our allies, has really caused some severe strain. The Germans are calling this the worst crisis NATO has faced since it was created. It's difficult. It's difficult to disagree with them on that.
Frank, anything you'd chip in on how our friends and foes are viewing us here?
Yeah, no, I would just a very recent data point. We just the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia just signed a defense agreement with Russia. That's just today or yesterday. They felt a void, and the Russians were all too eager to fill it. The Russians have also deepening their energy related relationships and moving forward with having 50-year energy relationships in the context of nuclear energy with some of these Middle Eastern states. And now they've expanded that to the world of defense. That should be extremely concerning to all of us, given our base structure in the region.
And just to piggyback on what Frank just said, Afghanistan doesn't exist in a vacuum. and Iraq and Syria and other challenges that we face in the Middle East are not entirely unconnected from the great power competition that the Trump administration and now the Biden administration are all saying they want to focus on. The fact of the matter is, when you signal weakness like this, and when you show that the United States is not a reliable ally on things like counterterrorism or human rights, that just empowers our adversaries, like the Chinese, who right now are whispering to the Taiwanese, do you really think you can count on the Americans to protect you if we come across the strait? Do you really think, as the Russians are saying to the Saudis, do you really think that the Americans are going to be a reliable defense partner? Why don't you buy our fighters instead?
Guys, maybe talk about Putin for a second, because here, as I understand this, we had, we've got 2,500 guys, or had that many before the crisis there. We hadn't lost anybody in a year, and the country was sort of stable. Why couldn't we keep forces there, small group, at Bagram, wherever they might have been? If something happens, they're there. Why was the pullout necessary? And I thought I heard that Biden had floated this with Putin, and Putin had said, no, you absolutely, not acceptable to me. I don't know if I could have that wrong, but why didn't we just keep a small base there as a quick strike force in a really volatile, scary part of the world?
Well, I think we could have. It would not have been costless, but it would have been, I think, an acceptably low cost in terms of treasure, but more importantly, American blood. As you said, we hadn't taken a casualty in combat for over a year. And that's not just because of the agreement that the Trump administration signed with the Taliban in 2020, February 2020. It's because when you look at the larger trend lines, responsibility for frontline combat had really shifted dramatically from U.S. forces to Afghan forces alongside American air power, going back to the 2014-2015 era. So I think it would have been sustainable. And I think the American people, who understandably are not eager to keep fighting a war in the Middle East or in South Asia, I think the American people, if explained the costs and benefits, could have been persuaded that, we've got 30,000 troops in Germany, and that's supported peace for 60 years after World War II. Maybe 2,500 in Afghanistan is not such an unreasonable investment.
Yeah, guys. And, one of the things I was thinking about, open for both of you guys, is that it sounds like obviously in the next 10 or 15 years, we're obviously going to be making a big transition to, energy transition away from crude oil. And obviously, Saudi obviously wants to be involved in that, as well as other countries, China. And I guess my question is does our administration, or do people in our government realize how inflationary this is going to be? And number two, we just don't, we've built up our shale resources over the last 5, 6, 7 years has really put us in a better political shape. How, just the geopolitics of that, going forward, if we're trying to set these timelines for the next 10 or 12 years, can we reasonably get there? And if we do, and China holds all the cards from a mineral standpoint, whatever the case may be, do people in the administration realize what a serious disadvantage we're putting our country in? What are the political implications of that? Or are we just so oblivious? We just got to get to this 2035 target, and so be it.
Yeah, I think there is a remarkable degree of enthusiasm around the innovation agenda, that somehow we will be able to solve how to engineer cobalt out of a lithium-ion battery, for example, without it going boom. We have the greatest energy labs in the world that DOE runs, but the time horizon for R&D, certification, construction, build out, scale, it doesn't seem to align with a lot of the timelines. And I don't even want to speak to the timelines that governments impose, because thankfully, U.S. government really holds very few levers to actually do much. What the U.S. government is able to do is do the R&D piece, which they do reasonably well, and then they can use regulatory structures to restrain activity of the private sector. You mentioned the shale revolution. I mean, I think your viewers, just to reflect on that history, that was initiated in the 2005 Energy Policy Act, which provided that the federal government shall not regulate hydraulic fracturing as a degree of the underground injection control program. They should not do that. What did that do? That sent the signal to the private sector to continue to innovate, deploy capital, get after it. 2008, the shale revolution was born. So my point here is it was under bipartisan agenda, was an exercise of government restraint that created an energy transition. I think we could do that if we took that similar kind of approach. What are the right kind of carrots and sticks? But before we go to the government, I would look at some of the time horizons that some of the companies have been issued on themselves. I'm looking at some of these companies to roll out, scaled and having everything done in the U.S. and looking at the supply chain, how you're going to do that. And I think we've got some real challenges. We could do that, though. We could do it. And I have great confidence we could. But we need the right kind of incentive structure. We need to effectively decommoditize these commodities. Okay, so what we ought to do, and I mentioned ERGI, we have to treat that these commodities, we can't have this race to the bottom, that the lowest cost producer means that they win. Thankfully, under the former administration, the government designated slave labor, identified slave labor in the solar polysilicon solar cell industry in China. This administration has continued most of those designations, and that's a good thing. We should not allow for slavery. Slaves don't cost a lot, right? Having this kind of build back better concept does. Giving people fair wages costs more, and that's a good thing. Doing things that don't destroy the environment, the way the U.S. industry does it, is a good thing. We should promote that. We can't have a race to the bottom and compete. So what I think we need to do in this context of Afghanistan, assuming that you see this Taliban development of the minerals sector, which there's a lot of headwinds why that won't happen, but assuming it goes forward, companies should stand up right now and declare that they will not source anything from a government that represses half its population, such as Afghanistan.
I mean, we can't have an energy conversation at the 8-minute mark in any energy conversation, ESG is mentioned. I don't know why ESG is not all over these issues. I mean, in the global energy context, there's no bigger sort of violations of humanity than some of the stuff that's going on that you're referencing here, Frank.
Absolutely. We need to. Let's talk. We talk about transparency reporting of greenhouse gas emissions. I have to believe that it's easier to have a degree of transparency over hard assets and workers than invisible gases.
And you're raising something which is interesting, which is, could we see U.S. energy, both new and classic, coming together and saying, because they both have the same issue in a way, the stuff we're doing here is being done at a higher standard than a lot of what's being done globally. U.S. oil and gas says that all the time. They're right. U.S., new energy flavors could be saying the same thing. U.S., rare earth mining here in the U.S., whatever it might be. So there could be a unique alliance coming together there in the future.
I 100% agree with you. And I think that that's the way in which, the European Union has started moving down this road in terms of creating this indigenous battery supply chain. They want to integrate human rights into that because they see this kind of idea. How do you have a supply chain if the Chinese or predatory investors using child labor in Africa, for example, can undercut your economic case. And so they're trying to integrate human rights in that. And that's a good thing. We should be doing that. And that is a place for government. It is a place for government. And I would encourage the administration strongly to look to that. The point about also the financing of some of these clean energy technologies, we talk about the R&D side. One thing that I've got real concerns about, I think we should all create concerns about, is there's this amazing kind of frothy market in terms of the finance. And you guys are at the head of some of this work, knowing this. But, if there's a notional supply dump of minerals coming on the market a decade from now, that's going to be a lower cost of capital, or practically free money. Why would I invest? And how do I secure my investment? How do I create a business case to make an investment in North America? We need to get ahead of that, and I think having this proactive standard setting, whether it's the Taliban or other repressive regimes and predatory investment, we should get ahead of that, because that's also going to create the confidence for the private sector, for the animal spirits, to make those investments in America, like we did with the shale revolution.
Nathan, if I could go back to the Iran question, first with an observation, just to provide some data points, and then to pose the question. Iranian crude production in July was about 2.5 million barrels per day. That was 600,000 barrels per day above where it was in August 2020. So there was a material increase as prices have risen. Yet Iranian crude oil exports in July, as far as we can tell, were about 150,000 barrels per day. So roughly sideways through the sanctioned period. So obviously burgeoning at the seams here, new production that if it were allowed to, would want to get into market. So here's the two-part question. Looking back to the start of this year, in your opinion, what were the odds of a revived Iranian nuclear deal happening in 2021? So, coming into the year, was that whatever percent, allowing those sanctioned export barrels to escape to world markets? And what's your opinion on how the developments in Afghanistan have altered those odds as we look forward?
Yeah, that's a big question. How much time do we have? I think coming in January, the Biden administration was very clear that they were looking to return to the JCPOA, the 2015 era nuclear deal. From a diplomatic standpoint, the problem is they didn't just tell that to the United States, they told that to the Iranians. And so I think the Iranian regime decided to play diplomatic hardball. And I mean that almost literally, because we've seen a lot of what you might call kinetic diplomacy from Tehran over the past 6 to 8 months. Increasing use of drones by their proxies, the Houthis, for instance, in Yemen, drone strikes on oil infrastructure and other civilian infrastructure in places like Saudi Arabia and UAE and so on. We've even seen an unbelievably brazen plot by the Iranian regime to kidnap an American citizen on American soil and take this woman back to Iran, where she would face torture and possibly worse. So I think what we're seeing right now, and we're seeing it in geopolitics, and the market is pricing this in as well. I think what we're seeing is, on the U.S. side, the U.S. is signaling a real determination to get back into a nuclear deal. And what we're seeing on the Iranian side is a signal that the Americans are going to have to give us a deal that is more favorable than the one we agreed to back in the Obama years. So I don't know how this plays out. I don't know whether the chaos associated with the administration's Afghanistan withdrawal will make it harder for the administration to get a deal done. Congress doesn't get a formal say in the process, but they actually have a very, very important role to play here. And, there's a number of Democratic members of Congress who are deeply skeptical of the Iranian regime. And I think the administration needs to have them on side. Maybe those hawkish members of the Democratic caucus would have been willing to give the administration the benefit of the doubt 2 weeks ago. But watching what's unfolding in Kabul, I don't know how that changes the calculus of that important, minority voice within the Democratic Congressional Caucus.
So can I throw a question in here, guys? You've both been very generous with your time. And again, Frank, thank you for helping us get to Nathan. Nathan, now you're part of the family, so we'll be bugging you as well. But I guess the question is around brand management. And in this case, the brand is the United States. We can be relied on. Don't mess with us if our interests are at stake. We do what we say, thinking about the brand, when we get involved, we win. I'm just thinking of all the things you would want as former State Department guys out marketing the country. I can understand why things go wrong. I guess what I don't understand is why we didn't have the focus on brand management. Like, for instance, we're pulling out on the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. Why wasn't someone in the White House, and I don't even mean from a substance or a morality point of view, why do you think someone wasn't saying, hey, whatever we do, let's look like we won? What do you think? Is that a weird way to think about how the country should be conducting its foreign policy? But I think that's something we all worry about as the rest of the world tries to take some clues from what's happening here.
I think our brand got tarnished this week. The American brand in geopolitics is powerful, principled, and reliable. And all of those core elements of our brand have come under strain in Afghanistan. Start with principled. We've talked in this administration about the importance of democracy and human rights. What about the activists that we are consigning to a very grim future under Taliban rule? We've just heard news today that the White House has decided not to extend the August 31st deadline for the withdrawal of American forces. And this comes right on the heels of the Taliban warning us, don't extend or there's going to be consequences. So now we also look the opposite of powerful. We look weak. We look like the Taliban can boss us around. That is not a good look for the world's only superpower. And then what was the third thing I said? Principled, powerful, and reliable. Pulling out after a 20-year investment in our military and civil society allies, and sort of disregarding the wishes of our closest allies in the world and NATO, including the UK, that does not make the United States look like we are a partner that can be trusted on to keep our word. So I hope the White House is able to right this ship, because it's not been a good couple of weeks.
Frank, can we do anything to change this? Like take Bagram, take action, stay as long as we want? Like what? Okay, it's where I don't know what quarter we're in if this is a football game, but how do we save where we are and rally this thing? What would you tell Biden if he's watching COBT right now?
Well,
what do you tell?
That's a far bigger question. I guess I would go back to kind of take issue with your premise a little bit about the brand. I think what this administration was seeking to do was change the brand.
Okay.
I think that they were trying to very forcefully, and clearly didn't go well. It was kind of like rolling out the new Coke, but they were trying to have a new brand away from the former administration, the Trump administration's more muscular, go it alone. How the perception in the media was. That's why you saw this staged conversation about America is back, and having diplomatic champagne moments. That was the new image. I think in my view, of course, if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. I was looking at it through the course of in the anticipation of the big climate meeting in Glasgow, where you had multiple iterations of climate-related discussions, and that was going to be the big moment. The question I would have is whether the mismanagement of this new brand rollout is going to tarnish that.
Well, that's fascinating. That's a fascinating point.
Special envoy for climate change, Kerry, in the people in the building call it SPEC, by the way. He was intending to call for countries to increase their levels of ambition above what they've already called for in November. What I wonder is whether countries now will listen, because of what's going on in Afghanistan. As Nathan was speaking to some of the reactions of some of our key allies around the world, inclusive of NATO, but also more broadly. So I can't answer it, but I would just challenge the initial president. I think they tried to change the brand, but the rollout went.
That's a fascinating point to end on, Frank. Nathan, we appreciate you so much. So great to meet you, Frank. As always, you're increasingly a member of the family, and good luck to you guys. And we really appreciate it. And to as I said in the beginning, the crisis there is a humanitarian crisis and something that we're all watching closely as Americans. So appreciate the time to talk a little bit about the bigger implications of all this. Close of business community, we've got something really special. We, internally at TPH, we shared with the firm that we were trying to do a show this week focused on Afghanistan and on geopolitical and energy implications. One of our colleagues, Spencer Harris, hit reply and said, "You should talk to my friend Corey Mazza. Corey's a Marine. He served in Afghanistan, and he's been helping families and individuals and just anyone who needs help in this tumultuous situation." And so we got Corey to join us. And so Corey, welcome. And I should stop talking, and you should just tell our energy community a little bit about yourself and what you've been doing.
Well, thank you, Maynard, and everyone for having me today. It's been a wild last week or so. My background's a little bit random how I got to where I'm sitting right now. I went to Harvard for undergrad. Afterwards, I played professional football in Europe for a stretch before joining the Marine Corps as an officer. I was a infantry officer out of 1st Battalion, 5th Marines down in Camp Pendleton. And it took a platoon of about 50 guys to a place called Sangin District in Helmand Province, Afghanistan in 2011. Real tough deployment. Our company had a very high number of casualties. The IED threat was very high. It was in the population. The population center was surrounded by basically their cash crop. And so it was a very contentious corner of Afghanistan. After that, came back, was in Washington, D.C. for a few years before going to business school, University of Texas, getting my first exposure to the energy landscape. Made my way to Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and private wealth management, now at a new firm here in Los Angeles, California.
That's quite a story. It's always fun to see Harvard men going into the military. We could use those crimson brains, and you probably learned a thing or two from those guys you served with.
Absolutely, it's a amazing experience to really get the full exposure to a cross section of America, and just having connections and relationships with guys all over the country now doing interesting and unique things. It's a lot of fun building those relationships.
So Corey, what would you tell us about how your veterans friends, how is the veteran community reacting to this? And then also a little bit about what you're hearing, on the ground and what you understand to be the situation.
Well, it's interesting. I've been out of the Marine Corps for a long time, as have most of the veterans I stay in touch with. The fall of Afghanistan and Kabul and the speed of which it happened, I think, was struck an emotional chord for a lot of us in a way. Just something we always kind of felt was imminent, but at the same time, when it does happen, and the speed and violence of which it happened was pretty powerful. Around that time, I started getting messages on email and all different social media platforms from a few former interpreters who were still there or had family still there. And it kind of started this effort about 8 days ago of how do we get our people to the airport. And it became kind of just running a gauntlet of Taliban checkpoints and navigating, a bunch of ups and downs along the way. And that's been where I found myself, operating from my desk at home or at my office, and or on the couch with the kids around and trying to coordinate families to get through to the airport and get manifested on a flight. And, escape what is going to be certain death for those that have been helping Americans in the past, fighting the Taliban.
So, Corey, when you hear from someone that's trying to get to the airport, how can you help them? Do you just try to get word to people who might be able to get their name on the list, or what? And don't give away any secrets here, but it just seems so hard to help from here. How have you been able to help some people?
It's that story in itself is one that I don't have the ability or the capacity to tell it, but it is absolutely remarkable. You've seen, and all through social media, really, you've seen, the first person who I saw really taking action, a guy that I replaced in Afghanistan, who's still an active duty major, who started working to get his interpreter out when there was still just a lot more uncertainty and chaos on the airfield, when the people were riding around on the planes. And I had been receiving messages from some of our others, and he was very helpful in sharing the playbook of how he was able to pull the snatch off and get his guy and his family off the ground. And then it just kind of became a aggressive outreach campaign using all the cold calling techniques from my time at Goldman Sachs of just being dogged and persistent and tracking people down. And all these strangers from different corners of the U.S. and really the world coming together to help when there was no skin in the game for them. Just remarkable. Just people from Palantir, I'm not going to get into the names, but just doing absolutely amazing things, getting people manifested on flights. There's a few military personnel that we had contact with on the ground who we put it out on social media. A former Marine might say, hey, I served with this guy. I think he's over there. A military spouse saw an Instagram post I had, reached out to me, was able to coordinate with her husband on the ground. He's ultimately the one that got my interpreter and his family in. Just absolute chaos, the nonsensical at times. There's no rhyme or reason to how it's been working. It's just been, I think, the tenacity of a lot of veterans, just saying, I'm going to keep going until we find a solution. And really, we're not doing much back here in the United States. The active duty Marines and the special forces units and the contractors who are actually going out and saving lives, we're able to just facilitate the coordination, and they're the ones that are truly doing the heroic stuff.
So it looks like we're here at August 24th. There's this 31st deadline looming. It's already difficult to get to the airport. Some of the stories are that it's going to get more difficult to get to the airport. It looks, Corey, like we're going through a pinch point here. What are you hearing or anticipating? Is it going to get worse, or are we starting to get enough people out that it's getting better? What's your sense of it?
It's really from the video and the FaceTime when I was on the ground this morning. I think it's getting worse. I think it's going to be really tough. You have a lot of people that don't have the special immigrant visa paperwork that are just fearful of the Taliban, and they're reaching out to you on social media and an email, and there's no connectivity to each other, but it's just a human life pleading for help. And you just want to shut your phone off, but you can't, because that's not who, we are as Marines and Americans, and just any good altruistic person. And so I think the guys on the ground are going to have tougher days ahead as the squalor of the living conditions of people have been in these muddy, just filthy conditions, no food, no water, babies dying of dehydration, getting trampled. It's just the horror that these young men and women on the lines are seeing, and then the trauma for the people outside the gate. It's pretty unfathomable, and I didn't really appreciate it until I was really brought in on FaceTime on several of those interactions, and it's just it's unimaginable, and it's just horribly tragic.
So Corey, as someone you're familiar with the situation, you served there, you're trained a military professional. Does it look like to you we're going to have to go back in and unfortunately have to widen the conflict to solve the current situation? It looks like you have to create corridors for people to get to the airport, like maybe you have to retake Bagram. I don't know. I'm not a military expert, but it looks like we might be moving towards a scenario where you have to almost restart the conflict to solve the problem. Is that on your mind, or is my overstating? I'm pretty far removed. So my visibility in the war in Afghanistan as a platoon commander on the ground, I equated to looking through a straw, because I knew my seven square miles of dirt inside and out, but I didn't have any context or experience the other 19 years of the war in all those different areas. What's going on in Kabul is incredibly complex. I'll say that. I don't know if there is a good or right solution right now. And the ingenuity and the just creativity of the people on the ground, and then back here supporting anyone that they know or anyone that is just trying to help is mesmerizing. I can't really get past that right now. So I don't know what's next. I know that Marines will do what you ask them to, whether it's fight or save women and kids. And I'm proud to have my name associated with that organization today, and the whole United States military with what they're doing. There are a lot of great shots of U.S. military, giving out water, helping the kids, passing the baby over the fence. I mean, some of the stuff is fantastic to see our guys, how they're helping. How can the rest of us help you or help anyone? Like how, I guess we're going to have everything from we've got to get people out to we're already getting some people out who need help. Like, what would you tell the rest of us about how we can be helpful if, because all of us are watching and wondering that.
It's been tough to be on the sidelines, right? And I felt like I was on the sidelines, and all of a sudden I got put into the game when I had no business being involved. And frankly, I'd love to be back on the sidelines again and just supporting. The way in which we've kind of seen it is the people that we can direct action and get out. We had a woman who had 10 kids last night, who she'd been trying for 5 days. And one of the Marines I served with, an Austin native, Mark Philippi, he owns a brewery, High Sign Brewing down in Austin. And he connected with me about his frustration. And so I went through another person that had been good and helpful to me. We coordinated a pickup and extraction. It was chaotic. We got them to the gate, the whole woman and 10 kids all inside the gate. Once they got inside the gate, the State Department or whomever said, you don't have appropriate paperwork, you need to leave. I reached out to a Harvard Marine buddy of mine who's Senator Tom Cotton's senior aide. He got involved in the middle of the night. Air Force major on the ground got involved. Families on a flight, they're out of the country. And like that type of stuff is what we've been able to do on the ground, just using our networks. But the majority of people reaching out are just saying, how can I support these refugees? And so I don't have all the answers on the nonprofit side, but I know that there's several of my past interpreters here struggling in the United States, 6 family members in a studio apartment, driving for Uber because that's the only thing that they can do. And with Zabi and my primary interpreter who's made it out, we've started to GoFundMe, and we're going to kind of get a board going to distribute it out to as many interpreters and Afghan refugees that make it over, and that we can help. And we're going to be judicious and transparent with how we fund those. And I'm happy to share the details of that GoFundMe with you all.
No, that's great. If you would please share those details, we'd like to do something, and we'd like to stay in contact with you because we know this is going to develop, and there'll be more needs or different angles on things. I know the whole the energy community, it's a pretty patriotic bunch, and I know they're all probably thinking about how they can help. So please tell us now and tell us more as things develop. Please keep us informed.
I think having a positive attitude and receiving these tens of thousands of refugees, I think is a mindset, and one that we owe it to them for the help they've provided to us. And then just as Americans, in terms of welcoming people here and doing everything we can, whether it's helping from jobs to just helping with donations or secondhand gifts, there's going to be an outpouring of support. We're already seeing it. And obviously energy and gas community is incredibly patriotic, and I'm proud to rep my Longhorn network. Married a Texan woman, so I'm not quite in the family, but I'm working my way close.
Oh, you're just increasingly coming our way. Then you'll probably we'll get you to move to Texan, and you guys can have actual Texans, and then the whole thing from here, Corey. It's going to be big.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share about Zabi and these other interpreters and the ones that we're going to get out, and definitely share the details of the fundraising that we're going to be doing in the near future for them.
Do you, Corey, at one point, maybe we could report back in a while, but it'd be really interesting to meet Zabi and just to hear someone talk about, this experience.
It's the Zabi extract was, it felt like out of a movie. And he's a funny guy. He's a really funny guy, and he'll make you laugh. And he's a smart young man. And we're excited him and his wife are safe.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Corey. Really appreciate it. We're going to share this with everybody, and definitely send us those links. And we're all going to keep watching this really closely. But thank you for everything you're doing. Appreciate you, sir.